Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. If this is the first video that you see, you may want to check my previous video to see what the channel is about at all. Today I'm going to walk you through a few configuration steps and basic operations with hypervisor by VMware called VMware ESXi. It is a very popular type of hypervisor in many big companies and big data centers. So it is a hypervisor which is called bare metal. You install it directly on the hardware. It's step one if you have done the homework for the previous video. And this typically can run almost any type of operating system you would want to run on it because it is a operating guest system agnostic. It just creates an environment to run virtual machines which emulate physical servers with ability to cluster them, to connect them to network, to provide them with any kind of hardware. And without further ado, let's go. Right now, I'm in a browser. I use Google Chrome, but you can use any browser. And I know the IP address of my server where I have VMware installed. At the moment, I don't want to tell you how to install it. It's a step-by-step process I can list later. Right now, we are simply connecting. So you see I'm providing HTTPS connection type to this IP address, which means we go by secure HTTP. And this should automatically load me into the login UI. You can think of it as logging into any of your computers you know remotely. However, this is done through web. So by default, after you install VMware ESXi, it has a web interface. This is called Vsphere Client, Vsphere web interface, and this is the most common way to control your virtual machines. I'm going to provide my root username. It's the same root type as you would have on Linux, and the password, and then I'm going to log in. So this is the basic way to log in. Now you have the full interface you would see as administrator if you were to connect to such server. I have another option. I can try to connect to it directly. I could boot up the screen of this computer, but then I would see something called DCUI, Direct Controllable, I think, user interface. So basically, it has a special interface for administrators. I'll show it later. Right now, let's focus on this basic interface. So here you have quite a few different buttons and places, but mostly you see the name and you see the version. This is my internal lab where I basically deployed my own ESXi, and it is a very small one. It only has 4 gigabytes of RAM, as you can see on the right. It has 5 gigahertz of CPU, so I don't really have an ability to run powerful machines here. But I actually cheated a bit here, because this ESXi is also running on a virtual machine on another ESXi. So I have a very powerful ESXi, which I use to deploy this server, which I can do anything with. I can crash it, I can reinstall it. It's my playground. And I have a storage system here, which only has 30 gigabytes at the moment. So this is how you would typically operate the system. On the left, you may see the virtual machines link. If you click it, it will display you all virtual machines running on this server. Right now, I have only one called test VM, which has guest operating system CentOS 7 selected. And it doesn't consume any resources because at the moment it is not running. So if I click on it, it gives me an option to power on. I can also click this big VMware icon with the play button, which would also start it. And right now you can see that I gave it one CPU and I gave it 1 gigabyte of memory of RAM. On the right, you can see I gave it 2 gigabytes of storage disk space. So this is how you typically create and run virtual machines. There is a button create machine. I'll show you how it works later. But right now, I just wanted you to be acquainted that you can simply connect by any web browser and you would see control options and you would be able to make and run virtual machines from web interface. If you would like to actually see your server, ESXi server itself, a bit more should be done. The ESXi server has Unix-like operating system, so you could use your Linux experience or Unix experience to control it. So typically what you would do, you would connect to such Unix server through SSH. It's a special protocol which runs by default on port 22. So let me paste my IP address here without HTTP part and try to connect. And right now I'm using a client called PuTTY or PuTTY, depends on where you're from. But this client is the most basic way to connect to most of the computers through SSH because it gives you all the settings you need. Of course, you could use other clients. So let's try to open the connection through SSH port 22. However, as soon as we try to do that, it gives me an error. Why? Because all ESXi servers, by default, for security purposes, have the SSH service stopped. It is very easy to turn on. So if you want to start digging into your computer on administrator level, and you have root password, you can simply click Manage on the left and go to the services tab. Here you have your system settings. There's a lot of settings you don't want to touch for now. But in the services, you have DCUI, which is the user interface for direct communication. This is what you see if you would have a screen of your computer connected to it, like on the physical server. And you also have this TSM SSH service. So if you start this service, that's enough to be able to get into the computer. So let me try this again. I provide IP address and port 22, SSH protocol open, and it connects me. So now if I log in and I provide my root password, now I'm in. You see I'm root at this server which I have created. And now if I simply go to root and see what's inside, you can see that it's a typical Linux file structure. For example, here you have user, tmp, proc, opt, etc and other directories. Usually we are interested in var directory if you want to check what's going on. So if you go to var and log, you'll see that you have all the logs, well, the main logs of the system. I'm usually interested in hostd.log, and there should be messages somewhere. Let me see. Messages. Is it running? I don't see messages. Cut mess. No. Apparently it's not on, but if you look at hostd, you can actually see what's going on up to the point where you logged in. And this is how you would normally access the log if you wanted to do this. And you can see there is even file unfound when I was trying to browse for some information. And this is the typical log you would see for most of the Unix-based systems. Uh, but we are not interested in SSH access. It's a bit complicated at the moment, unless you know what you're doing. So let me close it and show you around in the main web interface. So if we go to the virtual machines, this is the machine I have. It's CentOS machine, so let me boot it up. I'm powering it on, right? Look, it's supposed to be running. And if I want to see what's inside, I can click on the console. And the console would show me what's on the machine. Well, here you see that I actually cheated a bit. It tries to boot from the network because I have created this machine, I have given it resources, I have named the operating system CentOS because this is what I want VMware to think about this machine, but I didn't install any operating system. So right now it's a blank machine. It tries to boot from the network and I didn't configure network boot here. However, you can see that it tries to boot from Vmx free, and this is the first thing you need to remember. Vmx free is a specific network adapter which is available only in VMware. It is kind of an emulated network system. It has special drivers, and I will show you how to deal with it. But right now, this is what you need to remember. It's just a network adapter, which is the most commonly used in VMware. So how would we normally make this machine? Let me stop this because it will just try to get into the network and fail. So let's see how do we make a new machine. We are clicking to do this. We're clicking on Create button, and here we have a bunch of options. So we can use OVF or OVA files. These are images. Basically, they're templates or specific images which were prepared in advance. So you could make a machine, you could pack it as OVF file and give it to another user. Or you could make it for yourself and then use it multiple times to deploy the same server. This is a very easy way of deployment. You can think of it as sysprepping a machine, right? But in this case, it becomes a single image file which you can deploy multiple times. You can also register a machine, which means it is a machine which was created but then removed. However, it wasn't deleted. Uh, I can explain to you the difference between making a new one and registering it in a short time. Right now, just remember that creating makes everything from scratch. Registering uses existing files to deploy the machine which you prepared before, but it's not OVF, so it's not a single file. So let's create the machine first, and then we can browse which files it has and understand the difference between OVF image and normally deployed machine. So after clicking next on the creation of the machine, we need to give it a name. Let's say video test, right? We select compatibility because maybe you want this machine to be migrated to the server of 5.0 or below, and you don't want it to use features which are available in the newest versions of ESXi. By the way, right now we have version 7. I just haven't deployed it yet. So you can change the compatibility, but we'll leave it as is. We can pick the guest operating system. This is useful for other users and applications to know what you're running. Let's say Windows, but it doesn't matter at the moment. As you have seen from the previous machine, you can have nothing installed on it, but it will still be marked as operating system. And then you can select specific version. Let's say it's MS-DOS machine, okay? Next. We select where to put it. Datastore is a terminology for the storage device on the server. Basically, the datastore, it's a disk which is formatted with partition. It uses a special file system, VMFS. I'll tell you a bit later. You see here it says type VMFS 5. There are different types of file systems, but this is like in Windows you would have FAT32 NTFS or EFS. In Linux you would have ext4, you would have BTRFS, XFS. In VMware, all data stores are using this file system to store virtual machine files. And after that, we have all the possible settings we can give it. So I want to change it a bit. So let's give it 32 megabytes of RAM. It's a very old MS-DOS machine. We'll give it 100 megabytes of disk storage. Here you can configure type of USB, network adapters. I will keep it as by default. And in the options, you can also see that it has a few extra settings you can tweak. So right now, we just simply create a machine with one CPU. By the way, we also can set number of CPUs per socket if you want to emulate a multi-socket machine. We could also reserve a specific number of megahertz and limit. So we could say, let's limit it at 333 megahertz. So it's a very old machine. And there are a bunch of other options which we are not going to enable. So for example, this one doesn't have hyperthreading, and it's like the most basic setup. So we have one 300 megahertz CPU, computer with 32 megabytes of RAM, and 100 megabytes of disk storage for MS-DOS. This, by the way, useful to deploy some old or rare systems which you want to test, and you wouldn't have to basically come up with specific hardware configuration because you can emulate any type of configuration which is supported by VMware. If you wanted to add more devices, you could click add hard disk, you could click add other device, etc. Right? But right now it only has one hard disk. So I'm clicking next, where I can review everything I have provided. Just remember that it's a machine called video test, located on my storage called Datastore 1. It's supposed to run MS-DOS, one virtual CPU, 32 megabytes of memory, one network adapter, etc. So we are clicking finish. So in a moment, you'll see the new machine being created. So now we can boot it the same manner, but it will not do anything until we actually connect a disk or connect it to the network and install a system on it. You could also connect a virtual USB device. You can use a bunch of other things to install systems, but I'll make a separate video about the installation of Windows and Linux and other operating systems on the machine. So right now I wanted to understand the general concept of it. So we have this configuration. Right now it's nothing. It's only configuration. And we also have a bunch of files on the disk on Datastore. And these files will be booted up by the process of this virtual machine once you run it. Now, after you configured all of these things like settings, name, operating system type, hard disk type, where do you actually store it? On the data store. But how? So I wanted you to show something that is not often shown on the lectures or basic trainings. I want you to show the actual files of the virtual machine once you make it. If you learn to understand which files exist and why, it will be much easier to understand how it works. So right now I'm clicking the data store on the left in the storage tab, right? And this shows me that I have a data store of VMFS file system 5 with some settings, number of hosts connected to one because it's default ESXi without clustering, and there are two virtual machines on it. So if you want to see what's actually in the data store, you want to click Datastore Browser, right? So as soon as you click it, it shows you the physical structure of, well, it's not physical, it's a logical structure of your folders and files on this data store. So I have two folders, one for each VM, which are named as VM. And here is something curious. So theoretically, I could keep these files in the data store, but I could go to the virtual machines and remove them. Right click, and there is an option to delete and unregister. There are two different options. So if I would click delete, I would wipe the knowledge of this machine from the main hypervisor itself, and I would also wipe the folder with machine file from the disk. However, if I click unregister, the machine will begin from the main configuration. You will not see it in the browser, but the files in the folder will still be present. So if you don't need machine at the moment, but if you don't want to delete it, and for some reason you don't want to manage it as a machine, you can unregister it, but it will not delete your files on the data store. After that, you could go and register a machine. There is a so-called file Vmx, which you can right-click and you could register the machine from this file. So this is why when you are making a new machine, you had multiple options. You could create a new one, which would make this new folder with all the files for your machine. And you could use existing folder, which you removed before, to register a new machine. You cannot use the same Vmx file to register it twice, for obvious reasons. So right now, let's look at the folder of the machine we just made. It is a very, very basic folder. There is Vmsd file, there is Vmx file, and there is vmdk file. So vmdk file is our disk. We made 100 megabyte disk, and we have 100 megabyte vmdk file. So this is a virtual disk. This is like your zip file or your ISO file, or any other image file you can imagine. So inside of this file, you have a different file system, which is right now raw, so it's not formatted. But if you would boot the machine and format a disk inside of it, you would have a different file system inside of it, which would basically translate into the bytes in this file. So the data on the hard disk is binary, ones and zeros. You might have learned it. I hope you did, because otherwise some of my explanations may be difficult to understand. So inside of the hard disk, you have binary. Basically, it's either yes or no. This is how laser disks work, CD drives. You have dots, which has like zeros, or solid, which reflects the signal back. So the laser disappears, appears, disappears, appears. So you get your 1010 binary signal. The same thing you have on standard hard disk. So what you actually have in every file of hard disk, every file is a bunch of zeros and ones. So zeros and ones of VMDK file translate into zeros and ones of a virtual hard disk that you have inside of the machine. It's just a bunch of data. However, if this VMDK file is just ones and zeros, how does VMware know that this file has specific parameters like, for example, format and number of sectors, number of clusters? So if this file itself was simply ones and zeros, it would be not enough to explain it as a hard disk, because hard disk has manufacturers and various parameters. So let's try to download this file and see what it actually is. I'm going to save it, and I'm going to show it to you. Just let me open the folder, my downloads folder. Yeah, it's still being downloaded. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's 100 megabytes. I can show you something in the bottom. You see, there are already two files. The flat VMDK and standard VMDK file, right? So you have the file here, which is named the same as in the store, but you have another file which has 100 megabytes. And the first file was downloaded very fast. So in reality, VMware is cheating on you. Sorry, I have to tell it to you on the first date. It actually has two files which represent the hard disk, but it shows you only one for the simplicity of management. Basically, these files are not supposed to exist separately. So if you're administrator, you're going to move them together to different storages. You're going to delete them together, but what is actually going on? So the 100 megabyte file, I'm not going to wait for it to download. It's just raw data right now. It's zeros. I made it, it has nothing useful. But the vmdk file is the descriptor which explains what is this device. So if I try to open it, and I open it with Notepad, you can see that it's a text file, which tells you the type of file system it exists on, which data file, flat file, belongs to it. Uh, the disk is IDE. It has 203 cylinders, 16 heads, 63 sectors, and then a bunch of hardware settings. So this is what tells VMware what type of file it is and what does it have. So if you ever see a very small vmdk file, like 1 KB, or if you see a file named disk name dash flat.vmdk, it means that the pair has disappeared. So if you see a small file, it means the data file disappeared. If you see the data file, it means the descriptor file disappeared. That is a bad sign. It means that the file is basically corrupt because these files should exist together. More than that, if you connect to the server by SSH, you could go on Datastore on the storage and you could manually delete one of the files and basically break the disk. So this is why you should be careful when you do something through SSH. Now let's look at the Vmsd file. As soon as we download this, I can show you. It's also a small file. I'm going to open it by text editor. Right now, this is an empty file. There is nothing inside. This is a snapshot descriptor. I'll show you what happens. Once you make a snapshot, this file will have the content, but right now it's useless. And we will have another video dedicated to snapshots because it's basically a different type of beast. And I want to explain to you why a snapshot is not a backup. A snapshot is like a restore point you can make, but never treat it as a backup. And the last but not least is your Vmx file. So this is the meat of your settings. So if you download this file, and this is why it's useful once you want to register the machine, this is actually everything that is needed for VMware to understand what kind of machine you have. So you have the disk for actual user data, like operating system data files, but for the configuration, you have the Vmx file. And this is where you have a bunch of options which fully explain the machine. So you have the NVRAM file, which doesn't exist yet. NVRAM will be your virtual memory, like swap file for running the machine. You have different hardware bridge settings, which represent your motherboard. You have the floppy, which is not connected. You have maximum setting for CPU, right? You have IDE present, which is mentioning your disk here, so it's connected. And you have a bunch of other settings, like for example, for network somewhere here, Ethernet 0 is connected here, right? So this is basically your hardware configuration. It's like what you would show in a shop if you wanted to build your own computer. And this is what VMware uses to create virtual environment and run the virtual machine. So just to come back and repeat what we did, we connected to the server itself through IP address, like this. So if we connect HTTP IP address, we get a chance to log in into the server. Of course, you need to know your credentials, and it will be a bit slow because it's a virtual machine per se, so it's like a server in a server. Theoretically, you could make a like endless chain of virtual servers, one into another, until you run out of hardware resources. But for my specific training purpose, I just needed to make one into another, which is the main lab server. So once you connect, you have ability to manage your server. If you click on manage, you can manage the computer itself, where you can turn on, turn off services. You could install different packages like on Linux. You could create new users and roles. So this is a very handy way to administrate your main server itself. And if you go to virtual machines tab, that's where you can create new machines with any settings you want. You can also delete them, of course, if you no longer need them. After you create them, you have full access to the data store, which you can browse by clicking on Datastore Browser. And this is where you would be able to see and modify the files of the machine. Now, you may notice something. On this test VM, I have multiple files, so there are more than what I said. At first, there is vmware.log, which is useful to see what your machine does. So this is something we will be checking once we look into the scenarios of troubleshooting of VM running. There are also snapshot files here and CTK files, which are used for the backups. These are file types which we will talk about once we start talking about backing up virtual machines. That should be it for today. In the bottom, you can see my tasks which I done, right? Create VM and everything. There is a lot of functionality which I'm not going to cover in the brief introduction. Like we are not going to the third base immediately. However, if you have any questions about specifics of configurations, you can ask me and I can make like out of order videos for specific types of control setup or administration tasks. Otherwise, I'm going to just hope that I'll see you in the next video and I wish you a great day. Thank you for watching and stay safe. Bye bye.